But it is also, fascinatingly enough, and this is the genius of it is a control against the excesses of our communality. It says, yeah, we can come together and create something, but the one place where there are rules is that we can't create something too powerful. We can't create something too big, too strong, that might become the reflection of what we fought a revolutionary war against. And so the Constitution itself is at once a system, a structure, and a guard against what that system or structure might produce. Now, I realize I am starting to sound a little like the mysteries of the Catholic Church here. And when I say that America is not a Judeo-Christian country, when I say that this is not a religious state, I do not mean that this is not a spiritual nation, that this is not a spiritual state. And I think there is something of the spirit, both romantic and religious, in the calculus that created the American experiment.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are watching from, welcome back to my YouTube space. Of course, I'm happy to be here with you today, and there's a video, very good video I'm going to react today, and I want you to watch this video. It's about the Constitution. Now, there's a white author called John Nicoll. John Nicoll is talking to us about the Constitution as a spiritual book, or how Constitution is spiritual, the secrets behind the Constitution, and to be specific, U.S. Constitution. And why U.S. Constitution? Is because United States. It's because United States, I think, was the first country to have this constitution in 1787. The U.S. Constitution was created during Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia in 1987. A group of 55 delegates from the 13 original states gathered to draft a new framework of government. This group included prominent figures like James Madison, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin. The Constitution was designed to replace the Articles of Confederation, which had proven ineffective. After the draft was compared, it was ratified by the states and became the supreme law of the land. But apart from Constitution being good to the people, we have negatives too of Constitution, more so in black nations. In Africa, Constitution has played a bigger role in getting, like people in power who can't work for the people and you can't do anything. A constitution has led to more poverty in some nations, So constitutions has good sides, bad side, or negative side, and positive side. Now, I want you to watch this video and tell me in the comment section, what do you think of a constitution? Is it bad or is it good? For me personally, I think it has its good and it has its bad side or negative side. And we'll come back again and talk about that. But for now, I want you to watch this video of John Nicoll telling us the secret of a constitution.
But it is also, fascinatingly enough, and this is the genius of it is a control against the excesses of our communality. It says, yeah, we can come together and create something, but the one place where there are rules is that we can't create something too powerful. We can't create something too big, too strong, that might become the reflection of what we fought a revolutionary war against. And so the Constitution itself is at once a system, a structure, and a guard against what that system or structure might produce. Now, I realize I am starting to sound a little like the mysteries of the Catholic Church here. And when I say that America is not a Judeo-Christian country, when I say that this is not a religious state, I do not mean that this is not a spiritual nation, that this is not a spiritual state. And I think there is something of the spirit, both romantic and religious, in the calculus that created the American experiment. So you've asked me to come and talk to you about the Constitution as a spiritual document. And I'm delighted to do so. In fact, I actually think this discussion is more important than the election. Because the founders of this country didn't care all that much about elections. Elections did not excite them very much. You know this from the Constitution itself. They put no schedule for elections in the Constitution. It doesn't have any kind of sort of plan for primaries. They didn't even mention New Hampshire or Iowa. They didn't mention political parties. There's absolutely no mention of political parties in the Constitution. In fact, the founders didn't believe in political parties. They thought political parties would destroy the American experiment. They may be right. They didn't ever mention caucuses or conventions. They didn't say that elections should be held in November. In fact, in the first 50, 60 years of the American experiment, elections were held any time, for president, were held any time from the summer to the fall. They were held a whole different schedule. They didn't mention how you would do it. They set up this insane electoral college, and that was because some of them didn't trust the voters, and they thought, well, the voters might screw it up, so we'll have some elites to come in and settle things out. But they really didn't set up an election process. And there's a reason for that. They thought that we were citizens 365 days a year, not one day. They feared and knew correctly that the biggest danger in politics was that we would make it a spectator sport, that we would have a day, an election day, much like a Super Bowl, right? You'd have two teams playing, and you'd have graphics on TV, and everyone would watch from the sidelines, but not participate in a fundamental way in our political processes. And so elections to them were just a small part of the overall process. And so in an odd kind of way, it's very, very good that we would be out on this election day talking about the deeper meaning of the American experiment. And that deeper meaning is rooted in something that you won't hear mentioned very much in our politics. And that is that America was not founded as a Judeo-Christian nation. Now, John McCain said to me just the other day, I was interviewing him, he said, "We are a Judeo-Christian nation." That's a great line. And you know, Hillary Clinton, last night I saw her speak, and at the end of her speech, she said, "God bless America." And they all do. They all do. And I don't mind that. It doesn't bother me at all. We do have this wonderful thing called free speech. But we were not founded as a Judeo-Christian nation. And that's a really fundamental thing to understand. The fact of the matter is, the American experiment was founded as a response to, perhaps even a rejection of, the dominant Judeo-Christian paradigm of the late 18th century. Now, does this mean that the guys who founded it weren't Christians? No, most of them were. There were Jews among the bunch. The interesting thing is, we had a lot of Muslims in America at the founding of this country. Tons of Muslims. They were not allowed to practice, they were slaves. But understand that the people who were grabbed out of northern and northeastern Africa, northwestern Africa, were largely Muslims. So we had a huge Muslim population in this country. In fact, proportionally, our Muslim population was probably the highest at the founding of the American experiment. Much higher than it is today, proportionally. And the interesting thing is that if you go and you look in the sociology of the American South, you will find, in addition to those Scotch-Irish traditions, you will also find Muslim traditions. Fascinating interplay of all sorts of different religions at the founding of this country. Native American religions, which are deeply rooted in this country and highly respected by our first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. Great student of Indian spirituality. And so this notion that we were founded as a Judeo-Christian country is a wonderful fantasy. promoted by people in the current moment. But the fact of the matter is, the founders of this country had a real problem with where Christianity was at the founding of the United States, because Christianity had been corrupted. Christianity was used to promote a concept of a divine right of kings. What is a divine right of kings? Well, God chooses someone to rule over you, and that someone is a king, and or queen sometimes, and that king or queen has the power of life or death over you. Maybe completely immoral, maybe Henry VIII, once a Catholic, then an Episcopalian. The fact of the matter is that the age of the Enlightenment, often seen as an anti-religious age, was actually the opposite of that. The age of Enlightenment was a reclamation of true religion. It was a return to core values. And that was that one would reason their way to faith. One would come to faith by knowledge and learning and choice and experience rather than force. And what a horrible thing to do to religion. Think about it. That we would force it on someone. That we would say, this wonderful experience that can be so healing, so encouraging, so good for us, is something that must be jammed down our throat. That we wouldn't want it. We wouldn't want to embrace a loving God. We wouldn't want to believe in the glorious traditions of so many different religious faiths because, why would anybody want to do that? Of course, your natural instinct would be to be an atheist, right? Why would you want the joy, the healing of religion, right? Well, it's an absurdity. Of course, we do want and need religious experience. But it had been so corrupted by the British royal family, by so many of the other royal traditions of Europe, that the founders of the American experiment set out on a radical journey, incredibly radical journey. They said that no, God did not pick kings, that God did not decide who ruled over human beings, that in fact, human beings were divine within themselves. That this incredible, understand the incredible statement of Jefferson. All men, I should have said all humans, but all men are created equal. Now, today it's such a part of our discourse that we think it's common knowledge, right? Of course, that's a given. But understand, when Thomas Jefferson put those words on paper in that glorious script in the Declaration of Independence, that was a heretical notion. That was a dangerous, radical notion. Because in the British Empire, all men were not created equal. In fact, quite the opposite. Anyone who would suggest that they were the equal of King George III would find themselves on a ship headed for Australia, or Georgia, which was the great prison colony prior to Australia. And the fact of the matter is that at the founding of this country, this horrific corruption of religion and also politics, which was the intermingling of religion and politics through the divine right of kings, was something that the founders sought to overthrow. And in doing so, they pushed us to a whole bunch of new and frankly, at that point, unexplored ideas. Remember, the American experiment, there's a reason why people all over the world are fascinated by us. It isn't because we are better. It isn't because we are necessarily nobler. It is because we had a really good idea. And you know what? A really good idea is a powerful thing. The notion that the divine exists within all of us, that the good exists within all of us, that's a powerful thing. And it went beyond that because there was an assumption by the founders. Now, they were imperfect men. Some of them held slaves. That was pretty imperfect, the original sin of the American experiment. They were also all men. And that was also somewhat problematic. And they, as men can be at times, they weren't particularly encouraging of bringing women into the process. They were additionally all property holders, and if you were poor, they weren't particularly generous to you. The thing they got right, though, the thing they got right was the notion that democracy, some sort of democracy, could be an expansive process, that it could grow and get better. Jefferson had that wonderful phrase. You know, he held slaves, and yet he said, "I tremble at the thought of how God will judge us." He knew that it was wrong. And Jefferson, more than anyone, the incredible thing about Thomas Jefferson was he knew he was an imperfect man. Not many of us are that wise. Would that our politicians today were so aware of their imperfection. Some of them are going to be reminded of it today. But understand this. They did believe that those who came after them would be better than them. They thought we would grow and improve. It was a wondrous, optimistic notion. And they also thought something else, that rather than an individual, rather than a king telling you what was right or wrong, that the great mass of people, that some collective, initially in their early stages a rather small collective, but still a collective, would produce a wisdom and a good that was higher than the individual. That the collective, the community, coming together in an election, in some sort of form of governance, would produce something better than a king would pushing power down. It is today, again, today that seems like, of course, a logical notion, right? We'd accept it. I cannot emphasize to you, as a historian, it was not a logical notion at the time. In fact, in that time, you know, there were people at the founding of the American experiment who believed that they would be struck by lightning for signing the Declaration of Independence. They feared King George less than they did the wrath of God, because they thought, well, we're messing with the divine right of kings. We've been taught this is how it works. We're throwing this off. I hope we're not doing the wrong thing. And yet today we've moved all this distance. Even the Queen of England doesn't believe that she's all that much better than the rest of us. And in fact, I would argue that our current president probably has more regal views than the Queen of England. But that is an imperfection of human beings rather than political structures. Now, when I say that America is not a Judeo-Christian country, when I say that this is not a religious state, I do not mean that this is not a spiritual nation, that this is not a spiritual state. And I think there is something of the spirit, both romantic and religious, in the calculus that created the American experiment. And in fact, if you think about the American experiment, it requires an immense faith in humanity and higher calling. Dramatic faith in humanity. Think about this. You would throw off the whole structure of rule from above, of an inherited, that you always knew who was going to rule. When the king and the queen had a child, you knew that child was going to, you actually knew, you know how they do it, right? In Great Britain, you know the whole line of succession. Someone dies, some old woman dies in Sussex, and they say, she was 19th in line to the British throne, right? And you're like, wow, you know, you really, everything's orderly, it all makes sense, right? And suddenly you're throwing this all off. It requires immense faith, deep faith, to throw off all of these structures. And Jefferson, above all, was fascinated by these fundamental questions of belief and belief systems. You know, about 15 years ago, I had one of the great experiences of my life. I was invited to come and visit the section of the Library of Congress that consists of the books, the remaining books that Jefferson contributed to make the library. The Library of Congress was founded with Jefferson's library. Now, imagine this, that one man was enough of a book collector to give this country the core of its national library. And of course, I don't want to make Jefferson sound too noble. He sold his books to the federal government every time he went broke. And Jefferson went broke a lot. And so the incredible thing was, so he loved books. He's had this wonderful phrase. He said, you know, I'd sooner live without my freedom than to live without books. It was just, books were so important to him. And so what he would do is, he would sell his library to the United States, get a big, get $25,000, which at that time was a huge amount of money, and then he would go and buy a new library. And then he'd run out of money again, and then he would sell his library to the U.S. And the tragedy is that several fires, including in the War of 1812, when they burned Washington, burned large portions of his library. But there is at the Library of Congress a room with the remaining texts from his collection. And you want to know what they are, what those texts are? They're not the great books of the Enlightenment. It's not Rousseau or things of that nature. They are almost all religious texts. Now, the fascinating thing was that Jefferson collected books of spirituality, books of religion. And in that collection, which he contributed, were Qurans, were Torahs, were all the variations of the Bible. And also, you saw Indian texts, you saw India from India, Native American texts, American Indian writings and collections. You saw all Buddhist texts. He had Buddhist texts that had come from China. And the incredible thing of it was that Jefferson learned foreign languages so that he could read religious texts of different religions. Studied them all. And it said as much. In his writings, you will find that he said, I borrowed this section of the Declaration of Independence from Native Americans. I borrowed these ideas he did not write the Constitution. He wasn't actually at the Constitutional Convention, but he and Madison had a daily correspondence, and he would send Madison suggestions. And Jefferson would say, I borrowed these ideas from Buddhist texts, these ideas from the Torah. And it all came back to us in a wonderful moment. A friend of mine got elected to Congress in 2006 from Minneapolis. His name is Keith Ellison. He's a brilliant young lawyer, and he was the first Muslim elected to the U.S. Congress. There's a great controversy because Keith was going to be sworn in, and a congressman from Virginia, Virgil Goode, who amazingly enough represents Monticello. He represents where Jefferson lived, the Charlottesville area, said, and this guy, the irony of this is so good, you almost have to, you couldn't imagine it. The guy who represents Jefferson's hometown says, I don't want this Keith Ellison being sworn in because he's a Muslim. He will not place his hand on the Christian Bible when he is sworn in. He's going to swear his oath on the Quran, and this is a Judeo-Christian nation. This is a Christian nation, and we start letting congressmen get sworn in, putting their hand on the Quran. Next thing you know, we're going to have Al-Qaeda running all over America. Now, I'm not kidding you. This guy said it, and you know what? They had all these radio stations, and all these, well, Keith Ellison's going to get sworn in, putting his hand on the Quran. And it's they're all, remember, this is a country which had a horrible attack in 2001, and we still struggle to reconcile our relationship with the billion people around the planet who are Muslim. And so there are all sorts of people playing all sorts of games with Keith's swearing in. And so we had a conversation, and I said, it was because of this experience I'd had some years before. I said, Keith, I got an idea. Why don't you call the Library of Congress and see if you can swear your oath on a copy of the Quran from there? And he did, and the librarian said, absolutely, I will walk it over on the day you're being sworn in. And he did indeed go to the Jefferson room and take out Jefferson's Quran and bring it over, and Keith Ellison swore his oath with his hand on Thomas Jefferson's Quran. And Virgil Goode from Charlottesville sort of shut up. Because, of course, we had taught a little, small lesson about the American experiment. That, in fact, we were not founded. We were not founded to practice the corruption of Christianity of the late 18th century. But in fact, we were founded as a spiritually guided and spiritually enlightened state by the wisest men and women of the late 18th century. And the founders recognized that if this was going to be a new experiment, if we were going to do something new and different and better, then we did have to have some kind of touchstone. You know, Jefferson didn't just sit around reading all those books for the fun of it. You know, it's not easy to learn Mandarin Chinese. It is not easy to learn Arabic. It is not easy to learn Hindi to read a spiritual text. You do it because you're trying to get something out of it. Now, Jefferson loved scholarship. There's no doubt of that. But understand, you know, you want something here. And what he and the other very wise players, this remarkable group of founders, Madison, his dear friend, James Monroe, his other dear friend. You understand that if you go down to Northern Virginia, Monroe's farm is next to Jefferson's. The 5th president of the United States is across the road from the 3rd president. Madison's farm is 20 miles up the road. The 4th president, 20 miles from the 3rd and the 5th. You know, you can get up to the 1st president, Washington's home. And, you know, it's a day horseback ride. You know, and so you start to understand that they were a small circle of people. It would be like folks from Racine and Kenosha forming a country. And we were remarkably lucky that they were the people they were, as imperfect as they were. And what they understood from all of their studies, and George Mason, perhaps the most wondrous of the whole bunch, a very imperfect man, but someone who really studied so broadly. They understood that to do this new experiment, you couldn't just like throw it out to anarchy. You had to have touchstones. You know, you studied the great spiritual traditions to understand the good of all of them, the value of having a sacred text, a 10 Commandments, a Torah, a Quran, all of these different books giving people guidance on how to shape something. And they wanted to create a touchstone. They struggled with it in the first years of the Republic, after the finish of the Revolution. And they knew that they didn't want to create a sort of statement of belief, a manifesto, right? Like a Magna Carta. Magna Carta is a wonderful document. A brilliant, incredible, life-changing document. But it really, in most senses, it didn't really create something new. It just sort of said, well, you know, we're going to sort of respect these things, right? They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to create a new English common law. They didn't want a set of rules that you had to follow. They wanted something different. And what they created was a constitution. And the Constitution is so poorly taught today, so poorly understood, that most people do think that it is a legal document. And in some senses it is. It has legal significance. But it is not a legal document. It is best understood as an architect's drawing. It is a structural document. It explains a system and how we might, as a common people, come together to create a greater good. And the Constitution itself is, you know, the incredible thing about it is it's a framework. It is an outline of a system. And what is the point of that system? Two things. One, how we can come in, how we can come together as a people, create a republic, to create something beyond ourselves, not just pure democracy, but governance, and to move toward a rule of law, not itself being a rule of law, but rather a way to it, how we can come together and do this thing. But it is also, fascinatingly enough, and this is the genius of it, it is a control against the excesses of our communality. It says, yeah, we can come together and create something, but the one place where there are rules is that we can't create something too powerful. We can't create something too big, too strong, that might become the reflection of what we fought a revolutionary war against. And so the Constitution itself is at once a system, a structure, and a guard against what that system or structure might produce. Now, I realize I am starting to sound a little like the mysteries of the Catholic Church here. And believe me, as a child, I tried to understand some of these things, and it wasn't easy. And sometimes our Constitution is like that, that notion of these conflicts. But of course, every great religious experiment, every great religion has these conflicts, right? These yin and yangs that push against one another. And the mystery of faith, if you will, is to believe that while we may not be able to fully understand where they will take us, and we may not be able to fully understand every element of it, we may not be able to predict. And yet, if we believe in it, there is a good, there is a value that comes from that faith. And so, what are these controls against the excesses? This is a fascinating thing. We think of the Bill of Rights, right? The Bill of Rights put, George Mason, the great author of the Bill of Rights, the great proponent of the Bill of Rights, refused to sign the Constitution, refused to support its enactment until they attached a set of rules to the end because he so feared government. He so feared what government might become. Now, they had to listen to George Mason in the great American tradition because he was rich. And because he had, in fact, funded so much of the Revolutionary War. And so if the rich guy says, hold up, you got to, okay, all right, what did he say? All right, we'll listen to him. If you don't believe that, watch a rich guy go toward a candidate for president, and you will see, amazingly, their hearing gets really good. But Mason was a good player in this regard. He really did fear that the American experiment, the revolution, could be corrupted by creating too powerful a government. So he said, we've got to have this Bill of Rights. And we all love the Bill. It's the only thing that most of us know about the Constitution, right? It says, somebody tells you to shut up, and you say, I have freedom of speech. And somebody tells you, well, don't take a gun into a school. I've got the right to bear arms. And, somebody comes knocking at your door, so they want to check your house out. You say, you have to have a warrant. I've got privacy in my home, unless you happen to be using a telephone in the George Bush era, in which case you maybe don't. But unless, Russ Feingold is trying very hard to make sure that the Fourth Amendment still applies, but it's a bit in flux. But we all, we actually have pretty good knowledge of the Bill of Rights. But you want to know something? The Bill of Rights isn't where the action is. The Bill of Rights is indeed exactly what it says. These are amendments. These are addendums. The system, the significant part of the system is in the core document. It is not in the amendments. The amendments are, the footnotes put on to remind us, you want to practice whatever religion you want? That's cool. We're not going to have a state religion, anything like that. Freedom of the press? That's cool. Go ahead. Go print up a newspaper if you want. But the core of the document, the control against the corruption of the American experiment, is in the core text. And it is in the system of checks and balances, in the separation of powers, right? No government of the American experiment can be singular. It's not supposed to be able to do something on its own. You're not supposed to have a king who decides, well, I feel like doing this today, this is what America will do. No, you're supposed to have conflict. This wonderful conflict, the yin and yang of a executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judiciary all pushing and pulling upon one another to slow the experiment down, right? This very radical experiment. And to say, well, it's a good thing, we want to try something new, but we don't want to do something stupid. I didn't totally understand the Constitution until I had a child. And you realize, you want everything for your child. You want your child to be happy, you want everything to work, you want her to learn and do everything, but you don't want to do it too fast. And you don't want to do it too high you don't want to climb too high, you don't want to take too many risks. And so you have this system of checks and balances. And the separation of powers makes that work. But what did they put in the document as the fail-safe? Because in everything there's a fail-safe, right? You watch all those movies, right? And you got a nuclear plant or something like that, and if everything's going bad, there's a button you can push. Say, stop, something bad's about to happen. How do we stop it? The power to impeach. The power to impeach is exactly what George Mason said it was. The most important component of the Constitution. The essential component of the Constitution. Well, why is the power to impeach so important? Why is it more important than the Bill of Rights? Why is it more important than the separation of powers? Why is it more important than everything else? Because we fought a revolution against the divine right of kings. We fought a revolution against a monarchy. And only the power to impeach allows us to protect against a president or a vice president acting in a monarchical manner. And understand, this was a huge fear of the founders. Thomas Jefferson had a great phrase. He said, if we only rely on elections, if we only worry about elections and nothing else, once you are elected, you can do whatever you want. No power to remove in the midst of a term, no power to hold to account. If we only rely on elections, then we make our president an elected despot. We say, and again, and these are Madison's words, that the president is a king for 4 years. And as Madison said, we did not fight a revolution so that we could have a king with a set term.
Okay, welcome back. That was a nice video. I think it's part one of the video. It's a very, very nice video. And I've learned a lot from John Nicol. Now, is it Nicol or Nicholas? John Nicholas. The Constitution has a lot of deeper secrets that we, the people, don't know about it. And personally, I think the government has a lot of secrets. We call the system, the law and order, the democracy. Each and every these things that were put there plays a lot of role in the life of a human being, because there's some things you can't do simply because the law does not allow you, and maybe there are the things that can change how things are out here, okay? And there are things are being done because of the Constitution, because it is the law. It's not favorable to you, but it's the law. But I've listened to this video and know that there's a number of things I've known about why the forefathers of America decided to come up with a constitution. But you have heard that. My own concern is that, is a constitution a bad thing or a good thing? Of course, for me, I think it has a both side, negative and a positive side. And I'm going to talk about the positive or negative side of the constitution, okay? Now, the Constitution is essential for establishing the framework of a government. But again, it has its own challenges, as I have just said. And one of the challenges I found into a constitution is the rigidity and inflexibility. Okay? Some constitutions, especially those that are hard to amend, because there are constitutions that are very easy to amend, but there are others that are hard to amend, can become outdated or irrelevant over time. Now, when a constitution is too rigid, it can be difficult to adapt to changing social needs, technology advances, or evolving values. There are some things we can't do because the Constitution does not allow us to do that. Okay? And when you talk about the Constitution, it's very hard to interpret. For example, the Constitution of Kenya, we have interpretation issues. And even some people, not even in Kenya alone, even some people in Africa are suffering because it's hard for them to interpret the Constitution. So maybe they're having high taxes, they are paying for some things, but that they doesn't support to pay because this book was written in a very hard way to interpret. Just like a Bible, some of it, everyone has his own interpretation. Constitutions are often written in broad and vague language, okay? Which can lead to different interpretation. This can cause disagreements about what the Constitution actually means, especially when it comes to the right or powers. Okay? Another thing that has a bad side of a constitution is in some cases, a constitution may create a system where power is overly concentrated in certain branches of government, which can lead to authorization rule or abuse of power. Okay? Number 4, a constitution, some constitutions, particularly older ones, might not reflect the rights or interest of all citizens. For example, they may have been written at a time when certain groups, or such as women, minorities, or non-property owners, were excluded from full participation in political life. Okay? But if the constitution is very easy to, if that part is easy to amend, you can amend that. But some constitutions were written because on the line where women cannot do anything in the society. In system where constitution is interpreted by courts, there is a potential for judges to take a more active role in shaping policies, which some urge undermines democracy and the will of the people. Okay? Some political leaders may manipulate the constitutions to extend their own power. They might alter some things. Okay? For example, a leader supposed to be like 4 years and go, or 5 or 2 terms and go, they may change this constitution. They might manipulate this constitution to create a space for themselves. Okay? So, a constitution, that's the negative side of a constitution. But again, I'll say this. Constitutions are good. But I think a lot of African countries, constitution have been a damage to us, because these constitutions was brought to us by the colonizers. So it is very easy that the colonizers manipulated the country through these laws, through the constitutions, the laws inside the constitutions, and order and everything. It is very easy that African countries is being manipulated at large through this constitution. It's very easy. Because some of the laws, democracy, orders that we follow as Africans is just eating our country up. It's not helping the country. Something like democracy. Democracy has made us to put bad leaders to power. You go and vote, they rig the votes, but because of the constitutions, the democracy and everything, you can't do anything because you are following the law. Because of the constitutions, some good leaders have been removed from power simply because he is too good or she is too good. Because constitution allow you to impeach him, you can go to the parliament, you raise an issue, and then you vote against him, and the people won't say anything because okay, the constitution say you can impeach that leader. I voted for the leader I love and put him in power, and then you go there and you impeach him because the constitutions allow you. Because this leader is not favorable to you, is not doing things you have told him or her to do, you are forcing his impeachment, like what they did to Kenya. Vice President or Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua and some leaders there, they were impeached. Not by the people who voted them in, but by some random goons. Okay? Okay, constitution can bring a lot of things, good things. Like a constitution can establish a rule of law. It can provide a clear set of laws and principles that governs a country. And this help prevent arbitraries decisions and ensures that all citizens are subject to the same rules, promoting fairness and justice. Of course, if the constitution is followed well, there's some rule of laws that will put people in place. But again, I believe this constitution was used by this white man to make sure that these black people or these less people, they follow this one rule. I read something like the mark of the beast about the coming of the Antichrist and using microchips. So something like this, it will be easy to bring that to the people because the constitution or the laws will say everyone to be put this microchip. The law will say everyone should worship this Antichrist. And if you rebel, you are going against the law. Okay? So, as far as constitution establish a rule of law, but again, it affects some set of people who are not in line with that rule of law. Because it's not everyone that will agree with the law you have put. Okay? If the law is too rigged, no one will come into conclusion with that. Now, many constitutions include a Bill of Rights or similar protection for individuals' freedom, such as freedom of speech, religion, and equity before the law. This protection helps safeguard the rights of citizens against abuse by the government. Of course, that's the good side of the Constitution. But again, what I always say, democracy, Constitution, the law, order, these things are there, but they are not working out how it's supposed to be. It is just a tool for us, mere citizens, to see that things are okay. But at the end of the day, things ain't okay. Constitution may provide stability, offers a stable and a predictable framework for governance, providing a clear process for election, lawmaking, and handling dispute. This stability can help foster trust in the government and prevent chaos of confusion, which is good. You vote for a leader, he wins, you follow the rule of law, you wait for 5 years. But again, if these votes have been stolen, you will again wait for the 5 years. So you will end up having a bad leader simply because the Constitution or the law prevented you from doing something. I think Constitution may be good, but as I have had this video, the secrets of the Constitution, it's right to say that Constitution is good and it's bad at the same time. But again, this Constitution, the democracy, the law, the everything is one that is being used by the white supremacy to govern the whole world. It's only for the few. Only for the few people are benefiting from this Constitution. The few people are benefiting from this rule of law. Because even if they say no one is above the law, but at the end of the day, there are some people are above the law. And mere citizens or normal citizens can't say anything because it's a law. If you go against the law, your hands are being tied. So there's a number of things to dip or to dig inside the Constitution. But again, that video is part 1. I will come again with part 2. I think you have learned something from the video. Let's meet to the next episode. Until next time, peace out.